Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome our special guest of today, Professor Francesco Pierini, and you also. He is a professor for English languages at the Università di Genova. His special subjects, linguistic communication. He studied at the Universität of Genova, Università degli Studi di Genova, and also at the Università di Roma Tor Vergata. His main research fields are cross-cultural communication and specialized discourses. Since 2010, our colleague Francesco Pierini is working at the Faculty of Political Science and Architecture at the Università di Genova. He is also an expert in the field of general and business English, communication and public speaking and translation services. In the recent years, Mr. Pierini focused on political speeches. And this is the reason why we also invited him to give a lecture on a kind of masterpiece. It's Ronald Reagan's, the US President, speech, which he gave in the year of 1983 on the so-called evil empire. And if we look to the publications of Pierini, you see that he focused on many different aspects. L'inglese del management, so the influence of the English language concerning the Italian language. So what we call in German the Denglish, you know, in Italian it's
Itanglese.
Itanglese. So a mixture between English and the Italian language, and this process was starting in the 1980s. Maybe we had the same 1980s and then enforced in the 1990s. Yeah, ongoing. Many other publications I can mention here. La lingua italiana da unità in poi, lingua letteraria, dialetti e itanglese in varieggi e pirni A. And what is important for us also, the history of English. The history of English, a short overview from Old English to International English. It was published in 2012. Also important for us, the language of diplomacy. A linguistic analysis of Jerzy Buzek's address on EU-China strategic partnership in light of the challenges for global governance. Remember well, Jerzy Buzek was the president of the European Parliament. So a Polish European Parliament who became the president of the European Parliament, and he gave a speech on EU-China. Also important to mention an example of British Euroscepticism. The example is related to Nigel Farage. You know his name. He was the leader of the United Kingdom International Party, UKIP. So an example of British Euroscepticism and its expressive modalities, an analysis of Nigel Farage's speeches and articles 2016.
Too long time.
And the last thing I have to mention is multilingualism. It's a tongue breaker. Multilingualism and Englishization. Tongue twister in international business communication. The case of some Italian wine producers. 2016. I met Francesco Pierini 1 year ago when we had a workshop at the Università di Genova, and he gave a brilliant speech on that topic, and I thought this has to be happening also here in our research colloquium. And we also came together with a colleague of Francesco, Eleonora Guasconi, and we decided to found a partnership, Erasmus Plus partnership between Università di Genova and University of Hildesheim, and this will be one of the starting points of the foundation process of our Erasmus Plus partnership. Now we are happy that you are here and you have plenty of time let's say 45 to 60 minutes at maximum, in order that we have then ongoing discussion on your topic. Welcome, warm welcome, and we are happy that you are here.
Thank you so much. Okay, first of all, I wish to thank you for being here, and of course, Professor Gehler for his brilliant introduction, and of course for inviting me. Okay, and as he said, today I'm going to analyze and to explain the results of my analysis, a linguistic analysis, of this famous speech given by Ronald Reagan in 1983 that was called the Evil Empire speech. First of all, important to say that I'm not a historian, I'm not a political scientist, I'm a linguist. So basically, my research is focused on linguistic aspects of discourse. And actually, this is what I'd like to show you today. So, of course, we said President Ronald Reagan, 1983, Orlando, Florida, and actually the place where the speech was held, that's the National Association of Evangelicals. Well, actually, before examining carefully this research, I'd like to give you some preliminary information about language, okay? As a linguist, okay, this is a crucial part to me. So, of course, language is a very powerful means to persuade people, to convince other people and make them cooperative. And so we know that every communication is not, say, a single act, but it's something that produces an effect, always. So there's always a reaction to any kind of communication. So communication is effective just when the recipient understands and shares the message conveyed by the sender. So we have a sender, we have a receiver. In this case, of course, this is not one-to-one communication, because it's a public speech, so it's a one-to-many communication. So there are many recipients, but actually things do not change. So what kind of effects can we have through communication? Actually, to produce change at 3 levels, right? So one is the cognitive change, that is, I just want to convey new knowledge. So, for example, today I will have a lesson about Egyptians. At the end of the lesson, I will have new knowledge about the Egyptians. So nothing special, so just transferring information about the subject. Then we can have an effective change, that is to produce in the receiver new ideas, new feelings. And thirdly, maybe even most important and typical, for example, of political discourse, is behavioral change. That is, trying to persuade people to act differently. That's what politicians do, for example, when in the electoral campaign they try to persuade us to vote for them. So to produce and act a different behavior. So basically, in this case, of course, this speech, which may be regarded as a very effective example of persuasion, basically started from the effective and the behavioral change, right? So persuasion can be reached through linguistic, but also through non-linguistic elements. And talking about this, I will refer to the so-called non-verbal communication, the non-verbal elements of communication. So basically, the elements to be analyzed are words. So a persuasive speaker will have to choose, say, the suitable words and well combined one another, of course. Rhetoric, which is a very powerful means to persuade through figures of speech. For example, the metaphor, the metonymy, the analogy, and so many others, of course. And also, as I said, nonverbal elements, voice and gestures. Form is as important as the content. Okay? Right. So basically, the sender, in this case a speaker, because it's a speech, it's not a written text, it's a speech, tries to mobilize emotions in the listeners in order to reach, say, an agreement, and of course change his or her mind or behavior through empathy. Okay? So, this is a symbol of persuasiveness, as I told you, and the aim of the speech was to convince the public about the righteousness of his nuclear policy in a period when this was not regarded as the only possible solution to the conflict between America and the Soviet Union. Right? Well, look, in order to do this research, I actually based my readings on two main books. One is The Psychology of Persuasion, written by Robert Cialdini. Well, actually, I pronounce the Italian fashion, but actually I think it could be Cialdini or stuff like that. That's a psychologist, anyway. In order to see how persuasion works, okay? Because there are principles of persuasion. And the second one is Fairclough, okay? Analyzing discourse. Because in this case, we are talking about one of the founders of critical discourse analysis. That's theory and methodology of how discourses are to be analyzed. Okay, so basically, a few words about Cialdini and so the principles of persuasion. Well, actually, he identified 6 main principles that are at the basis of persuasion. Look, persuasion is something that takes place in everyday life. Okay? So every time we speak to someone, every time we communicate to someone, persuasion is at work, actually. Okay? And goes without saying that, politically speaking, in diplomacy, of course, persuasion plays a crucial role, right? So he says, reciprocity, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity are the main principles working in favor of persuasion. Just a few words to explain what they are about. Well, actually, first one, reciprocity. Anytime someone does you a favor, you will feel obliged to repay it. Okay? And so this is a good way, if you want to obtain something from somebody, you do them a favor, and they will feel, obliged to pay it back. So this is the first element. Commitment and consistency. Once someone has made a choice, he or she will feel obliged to keep it, okay? Especially when this promise, when this commitment was made before a public, okay? So if you vote for me, I will build a lot of new schools. Well, actually, this is something I will have to keep in order to be consistent with what I said, okay? Social proof. Sometimes people do not exactly know what to do, and they usually act looking for orientation in the people around them. If some people do it, I will do it myself, okay? Great. Authority. People admire and respect authority. In this case, remember, we are talking about the President of the United States. Okay? Since we are children, we are, say, used to respecting authority. Just think, for example, of nursery rhymes regarding obedience, respect, and all the stuff related to this. And of course, authority, for example, experts, title, or status, of course, improve credibility. Okay? Liking. Well, actually, this is a principle that works a lot in advertising, but also in politics. Okay? People will agree more to people they like. In particular, starting from physical attractiveness. But good looking is not the only aspect related to liking. So, similarity, for example, cooperation, and other elements can, say, put this principle at work. Okay? When you are physically attracted by someone, but also psychologically, of course, this is a good principle of persuasion. And last one, and we could say last but not least, that's scarcity. Okay? This is actually in Italy a lot used in order to say, for example, create groups, divide people into categories, finding someone who is good and somebody else who is evil, you know? So, people value and want scarce things more than things that are around in abundance. Okay, so for example, a potential loss plays a greater role than a potential gain. So slogans such as British jobs to British workers in electoral campaigns, or for example in Italy, at the moment the Northern League and Salvini against immigration, okay? Loss of jobs for Italian people, lots of council houses for Italian people, just because of immigrants. And so scarcity is something that really persuades people. Of course, all of these elements have been used by Ronald Reagan, to some extent, in order to persuade the public. It was not an easy public, if we think about it. We are talking about someone, we are talking about people, well, actually, very faithful people, to whom he was supposed to say that, say, it was not the right moment, okay, to reduce armaments, okay? And so actually it was not an easy public. But before, I just want to give you further elements related to the analysis of discourse, right? So what is discourse, basically? If you remember, long ago, linguistics was mainly based in analyzing words. It was grammar, okay? Basically, discourse is language in use, in communication, right? Both written and oral. But larger, the unit is larger than a simple phrase. So discourse is something longer, okay? Discourse analysis aims at revealing the socio-psychological features of a person, of people, right? Through naturally occurring language use. So I remember that when I was at school, the first things I learned in English is the cat is under the table, okay, which never happened. And so, well, actually, this is abstract communication. It doesn't exist. Actually, discourse analysis wants to focus on naturally occurring language use. It's a form of social practice. It takes place in conversation, but also in a speech, such as the one we are going to analyze. And the fact is that language is discourse is shaped by relations of power and invested with ideologies. So we can say that behind our words there's something hidden, okay? And sometimes in order to understand, to really understand what a discourse is about, it is necessary to work on it and not to limit ourselves to the surface structure, what naturally comes out, but to hidden structures. That is, to something which is not so evident, but it's hidden through the words used by the speaker, by the author. So critical discourse analysis, in particular, is a methodology which tries to focus on the way discourse reproduces or resists social and political inequality and power abuse, domination, okay? Actually, we could say that critical discourse analysts try to work in order to see the dynamics of power and hidden ideologies behind words in order to find solutions. And so, as you can see, this is, I'm quoting Feuerbach directly, it is mainly in discourse that consent is achieved. Ideologies are transmitted, and practices, meanings, values, and identities are taught and learned. Okay? So, causes that are hidden, and this is, so basically, in order to analyze Reagan's speech, one part will be, say, drawn from Cialdini's principles of persuasion, and the other part will be based on this methodology of linguistic analysis. Okay, well, of course, context. Any discourse is based on a context. Okay, so basically we can say that it comes from the social situation of the discourse. So we could say, for example, space, time, roles of the participants, the interest, and what is at stake. This is the context, the social situation of discourse. The second element is society as a whole. Okay? So, what does society think? Or how is society involved in what we are saying? So there are power relations, conflict areas, maybe hegemonic ideologies behind. Okay? And so, when Reagan gave this speech, what was happening around him? I mean, the United States, but also the world. Okay? Remember, we are talking about two powerful nations that not only would determine their personal destiny, but the destiny of all the world. So this is not only the social situation of the event, but also society as a whole. And of course, every discourse is connected to past and future discourses, okay? It's not isolated. It's something based on what was said before and what will be said later, at a later stage, okay? Right. So there are some elements, of course, in discourse. Actually, these are, technicalities, because there are different types of discourse. In this case, the genre we are, let's say, analyzing is a political public discourse. That we have typical elements. If we analyze, for example, the media discourse, there will be other typical elements. Okay? So we want to understand the framing, that is the topic of the discourse, and how it is dealt with by the speaker. Okay? So we want to see how it is represented, so the ways to represent reality, okay? The interaction, so how the producer interacts with the participants, and of course, organization. How is the narrative structured, okay? And of course, after that, we can interpret data and have results. Look, of course, there are also criticisms to this methodology, and this methodology doesn't give you necessarily all the elements, because you can decide to analyze, say, from different points of view. Say, for example, you can decide that, I don't know, non-verbal elements of communication may be more important, or maybe you can decide that words are more important. So you can decide to focus, to stress specific aspects, and to leave out others, okay? Anyway, so this is basically the elements to consider as regards the methodology and the objectives. But very quickly, because after the analysis we will return, we will go back to them. So the topics, and so to identify what the discourse is about. Okay? The macrostructure, the semantic macrostructure of discourse. Local meanings, that is the information given to the public, in this case, through the choice of the words that influence the recipient, of course. Okay? Metaphors, yes. This is a very important element, and remember that this text is, say, remembered as the evil empire speech. This is a winning metaphor, okay? So metaphor is really important. Of course, as we said, there are subtle formal structures, such as nonverbal communication, so gestures, face work, body position, distance, because we also communicate with body language. Context models. What is relevant to the participants, not only to the speaker, to the participants, and so this links the text to the social situation. I'm going to talk before a public of very faithful people, okay? So I will have to adapt my speech to them. How can I link the speech to the social situation, linguistically speaking? Okay, intertextuality. Okay, in this case, you will see that in any speech, when you want to persuade, you will refer to other speeches, quotations, stories that will be used in the new speech to give more emphasis and benefit to what you are saying. This is called recontextualization. You will see, for example, that in Reagan's speech there are many references to the Bible, in this case, used by Reagan just to make his points stronger. So this is a typical example of recontextualization. Oh my God, this is not so easy to say. And then assumptions. This is another important element. That's a sort of accepted cause and effect relationships, but something that is taken for granted without any, say, substantial element. Okay? Something like, let me see, I'm happy today, so everybody is happy today. I'm happy, it doesn't necessarily mean you're happy, of course, But this is something typical in discourse. You take something for granted and accept it. Okay, of course, as I said, discourses have their own history, which is not represented by the text alone, but by other aspects, contexts and participants. So, my question was, what had happened before the speech? Look, the American Congress was about to support a nuclear freeze policy. Okay? This, of course, was supported by the Soviets, but not by Reagan, who supported a pro-defense attitude. The speech was directed to the National Association of Evangelicals in London. So a very, say, peculiar religious community. And of course, in society, we could say, nuclear armament was not regarded as the single correct response. Okay, the speech lasts 29 minutes, and Ronald Reagan is really capable of starting. Well, the first part of the speech is just, to build empathy with the public. Okay? And of course, his faith-based background makes him establish a very good relationship with the public. Okay? So, for example, he starts his speech by thanking for the prayers. That is, I know that he prayed for me, and so this gives him a sense of inclusiveness. Okay? So you are Christians, I'm a Christian too. So this is the first way to establish rapport, empathy. So his own faithfulness in order to, establish a sense of similarity. I'm here today because I'm similar to you. He recognized the importance of the church in society, and so he, recognized the role played by the people who was in the public. He established pathos, right? Just talking about very sensitive issues to the public: abortion, teenage sex, and drug. And, actually, he increased his credibility through the solutions that his government had offered to those problems. Remember that to evangelicals, this kind of, problems were really deeply felt by the community. So he just touched the right chords, right? And of course, he was also, he balanced humor and seriousness, and this gave him a great ability to balance. He was not boring, he was not, too ironic, but he was able to balance the two, elements. And of course, we will also see how he put into practice the previous mentioned Cialdini's elements of persuasion. Okay, look. So, this is only the final part of the speech. Well, not so final actually, we will see some sentences. But, after gaining, credibility, after establishing empathy with the public, he says, and this brings me to my final point today, okay? He's going to introduce the real topic of the speech, During my first press conference as president, he makes resort to an anecdote, to a personal story. this gives him extreme credibility to his words. I pointed out that as good Marxist-Leninists, the Soviet leaders have openly and publicly declared that the only morality they recognize is word revolution. The only morality they recognize. Actually, this clashes with the idea of morality in the Christian faith. Okay? So be careful, because he starts by saying that to the Soviets, morality is word revolution. So, word revolution, this is a very strong concept, really clashing with Christians' idea of morality, right? Look, I think I should point out, I was only quoting Lenin, their guiding spirit. The guiding spirit of the Soviet is not God, is a man, okay? So again, a clash. Who said in 1920 that they repudiate all morality that proceeds from supernatural ideas? And he says that's their name for religion, sort of, metaphor. Religion is not religion, it's just supernatural ideas. And of course, look, the verb to repudiate, that's something very strong, okay? Morality is entirely subordinate to the interests of class war. Everything is moral that is necessary for the annihilation of the old exploiting social order. Look, morality is associated to a very bad word, annihilation. And the social order, the old social order, is regarded as exploiting. This is again a negative word. Okay? So, well, actually, this introduction to the Soviet word is something that doesn't create a sympathy, of course, but prepares the ground, it paves the way to arrive at what it was actually at the final purpose of his speech. Okay? And of course, he also refers to influential people in the US that are against, that can't see what is happening in the Soviet Union. We saw this phenomenon in the 1930s, we see it too often today. The Munich analogy, isn't it? Okay? So be careful. We might risk to make the same mistake it was made long ago. I guess this is a typical element in the speeches of many American presidents to refer to the Munich analogy, because it is a very strong one. It is, look, we were not able to see how dangerous Hitler was, we shouldn't make the same mistake. This Munich analogy was also used in order to justify the attack to Saddam Hussein, for example. It was, again, a typical quotation to support belligerent ideas, right? But of course, we are Christians. Be careful, because he's able to build an idea of good against evil. This doesn't mean we should isolate ourselves and refuse to seek an understanding with them. Of course, we do. I intend to do everything I can to persuade them of our peaceful intent. Okay, look at the use of pronouns. Pronouns are important in linguistic analysis, but just because they can transmit inclusiveness or exclusiveness. They have a sense of territoriality. Okay? We, in this case, the president, the Congress, the people, we, and they, our opponents. So these are words in order to, transmit a sense of inclusive or exclusive ideas. I intend to do everything I can. That is, everything I can. What does it correspond to? Basically, this is a very good sentence, because it means you will do your best. But actually, what's the meaning of the word, of the expression? It's empty. It doesn't mean anything. You're not saying what you're going to do. But of course, you say that yours is a peaceful intent. That's what they want to hear, Look, 39. We will never compromise our principles and standards. We will never give away our freedom. We will never abandon our belief in God. 3 times. Repetition is important. The repetition of the same word or of the same sentence is typically used in rhetoric and so in political discourse, just because 3 is a magic number, And so repetition helps to memorize ideas. And look, he's also able to add a 4th one, because he says, and we will never stop searching for a genuine peace. Okay? So he tries to be very, very convincing. Look, we can assure none of these things America stands for through the so-called nuclear freeze. When you do something like this, or you say the so-called, these are called scare quotes. And it's something you say in order to, put a distance between the words you are saying and your real ways of thinking. This is the so-called nuclear freeze, but actually I don't share this nuclear freeze, okay? Proposed by some. Okay. The truth is that, I guess this is an assumption, don't you think so? Because a freeze now would be a very dangerous thought. Who says this is the truth, actually? You say so. But of course, the freeze is regarded as a dangerous thought. Is merely the illusion of peace. Why? We do not have any evidence, of course. The reality is that we must find peace through strength. It's rather clashing as concept. Peace through strength. Sort of an oxymoron. Okay? So two, clashing ideas. The word freeze, of course, occurs many times in the text. Hardly ever with a positive meaning. It's always negative. Okay? So, and now he's ironic. He can also use irony as a rhetorical figure. I would agree to a freeze if only we could freeze the Soviets' global desires. Then you see laughter and applause, right? Virtually end our chances to achieve the major arms reduction which we have proposed. Because a freeze, as it is proposed now, would virtually end. Virtually. Virtually is not a word with a clear meaning. Because virtually means something unreal, actually. And of course, they would achieve their objectives through the freeze. A freeze would reward the Soviet Union for its enormous and unparalleled military build-up. It would prevent the essential and long overdue modernization of the United States and allied defenses and would leave our aging forces increasingly vulnerable. Look, the principle of scarcity, Cialdini's principle of scarcity is there, okay? So people would feel very vulnerable. This is a winning adjective he used. People don't want to feel vulnerable, of course. An honest freeze, so that means the freeze proposed is dishonest. An honest freeze would require extensive priors, negotiations, and blah, blah, blah. And the kind of a freeze that has been suggested would be virtually, again, virtually, impossible to verify. Why virtually impossible? You're not, say, trying to defend your thesis. Why? You're just saying virtually impossible. Look, passivization, the use of passive is typical when you don't want to mention the agent of an action. That has been suggested, so this is typically important in the analysis of discourse, when there is no expressed subject, actually. So you prefer to use the passive form because the subject is not identified. And now, well, of course, social proof, we said. Someone does something, and the other people will do the same. And this is also an example of intertextuality, what I said before, that is, you used another text to your own advantage in another text. A number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man of California. It was during the time of the Cold War, and communism and our own way of life were very much on people's minds. I was speaking to that subject, and suddenly, though I heard him saying, I love my little girls more than anything. Okay? And of course, he went on, the man speaking, I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God. What else could they expect? I mean, there were thousands of young people in that audience. They came to their feet with shouts of joy. They had instantly recognized the profound truth in what he had said with regard to the physical and the soul, and that was truly important. Okay? So a man said, I would prefer, the death of my daughters, and so actually people were shouting of joy and imitated him. But of course we are Christians, so let us pray for the salvation of all of those who live in that totalitarian darkness. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God. And then, here, he introduces the metaphor, giving the title to the speech. Until they do, so until, let us pray for the salvation of the people who live in darkness. Darkness, this word is usually referred to religion. You live in the darkness because you have no faith, of course. But this is associated to the adjective totalitarian, so that's also political darkness, okay? They are the focus of evil in the modern world. They are the focus of evil in the modern world. Okay, then there's another recontextualization, talking about the writer and his idea of dictatorships. And look, as we said, if history teaches anything, it teaches that simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is folly. So there is a recall to this wrong idea of appeasement. Okay, this is something we can't do. So I urge you, I encourage you to speak out against those who would place the United States in a position of military and moral inferiority. Again, scarcity. Okay? I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and so remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, good and evil. So in this case, there is a reference to religion because we have the word temptation, the word pride. Pride is negative. And if you don't take a stance against evil, okay, basically, this is against Christianity, of course. Just because you say, oh, but this is all, a giant misunderstanding, so I don't want to take any position. Well, actually, if you do that, you're just removing yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, good and evil. And this is not Christian. I ask you to resist, okay, against typical of religious discourse. To keep America strong and free, while we negotiate real and verifiable reductions. With God's help, the total elimination of nuclear arsenals. So, of course, America will play the part of the hero, of course. But in the meantime, I don't want any freeze. So, what is important is that Reagan says military strength is important, but actually not so much what I see in the word, and this is another element, sort of a snake in the grass, because it works subliminally. The real crisis we face today is a spiritual one. At root, it is a test of moral will and faith. So the problem is not armaments. This is something which is not so relevant. It's actually spiritual crisis. Okay? And of course, this is a way to fight against the spiritual crisis. He mentions Whittaker Chambers, the alleged communist spy who repented, okay? He had a conversion, and Whittaker Chambers was often mentioned in his speeches as an example, okay? Chambers wrote that the crisis of the Western world exists to the degree in which the West is indifferent to God, the degree to which it collaborates in communism's attempt to make man stand alone without God. Look, genius. Okay? If you call yourselves out of the story, you will be guilty, because the problem is not armaments. The problem is the spiritual crisis. And so, it's because if you don't participate, if you don't share my ideas, this is just an example of how the West is indifferent to God. Evangelicals don't want to be told they are indifferent to God. And so this is, strategic to their sharing of his speech. Look here. And then he said, for Marxism, Leninism is actually the second oldest faith, first proclaimed in the Garden of Eden with the words of temptation, you shall be as gods. So, Adam and Eve, okay, the snake, okay, the sin. And so, if you think that man can replace God, you are sinners. You don't share, you shall be as gods. For this reason, okay, this is the point he's outlining. The Western world can answer this challenge, but only provided that its faith in God and the freedom he enjoys is as great as communism's faith in man. Okay? Look. Okay, so as you can see, I believe we shall rise, I believe that, I believe. These are typical repetitions that help, of course, to make the public memorize these words. So, I believe this because the source of our strength in the quest for human freedom is not material, but spiritual again. And because the quest knows no limitation, it must terrify and ultimately triumph over those who would enslave their fellow man. So, no limitation, because it is spiritual. It's not based on, it's not material, but it's spiritual. Okay. Yes, change your word. This is moving the public to action. You know, as we said, one of the effects of communication. Now he's moving them to action. So change your word, you can do it. And of course, well, God bless you and thank you very much. Okay, look. So what is the discourse about? Just going back to the principles of critical discourse analysis. He used a long time to talk about how the church is important and how religious people are necessary and stuff like that. But actually, he just wanted to get to the point, that is, supporting his armament policy. Information that influences the mental models of the recipient, the use of pronouns. We, the good, they, the evil, good and evil, right? Modality, the use of modality. Modality concerns the writer's or speaker's attitude toward and or confidence in the proposition being presented. So, in few words, because we are not technicians, but the use of modal verbs, for example, can, shall, may, might, basically expresses an idea. They must be made understood. They must. It gives the speaker's idea of what should be done. A modal verb is not something like sleep, eat, drink. It's something expressing a point of view. It can be obligation, it can be ability with can, but of course it expresses a point of view. Well, metaphor. There were many, but of course we focus on the evil empire, the metaphor used. Well, actually, as regards nonverbal communication, we can see that Reagan was extremely calm while he was delivering his speech. So a very deep and relaxed voice, not nervous at all. Context model, so what is relevant to the participants? Well, actually, his religious belief to support his speech. For example, he mentions his wife, Nancy, and so this is a link with marriage. Marriage is a very important Christian value. And so this, it's implicit. It's implicit because it doesn't mention marriage, okay? But of course, talking about Nancy gives the idea that marriage is a very strong value to him. Intertextuality, as I told you before, he cites the Bible many, many times. Assumptions, we see cause and effect when there is actually no evidence of these cause and effects between things. Okay, persuasion. Cialdini's principles. I only mentioned 2 or 3 during the presentation. I said scarcity, talking about aging forces, referring to the American army and the need to modernize forces. Well, authority, well, actually, we say we are talking about the president of the US, so of course it's a sign of authority. And look, reciprocity. Politics has done so much for birth control, religious issue, and showing the proximity of the church. For this reason, I expect you to pay back what we did for you. Someone might say, but actually, commitment and consistency. That is, I'm here today, I'm listening to your speech. I guess that this second item is shown through the long applauses, and they're standing up to support their agreement at the end of the speech. So basically all Cialdini's principles are actually present. Okay? So basically we can say that Reagan's speech was extremely persuasive because he applied the principles of persuasion, and because through the linguistic analysis we see that many words used, many linguistic elements, okay, were in favor of finding empathy with the public, and through the wise use of words, he was able to make American people feel better and to make them feel responsible in case they wouldn't take a position against the Soviet Union, just because, well, basically, he was going to divide people into 2 categories, okay? We said right or wrong, good or evil, and this is why actually, well, this speech was not only, I could say, winning in that situation, but it was a speech that became, say, very famous, and we can say that it contributed to the American victory in the Cold War, actually. And I would say that's all. I'm sorry, I hope I've been, credible,
convincing, persuasive.
I hope so. And, well, I don't know,
yes,
Professor.
Yes, I would like to thank you very much. I would like to thank very much our speaker. And please come to the camera. We should be,
yes,
on the screen. Thank you very much. I think what we learned is there are important principles of persuasion and also a critical discourse analysis. And you referred to also experts like Pierini, Verklav, and I think we have now 30 minutes time for discussion, and you made a very precise, criteria-oriented analysis of this famous speech, and we have now the possibility to raise questions, to ask questions to our speaker, and you can, yes, open discussion. The floor is open for discussion. We can start our debate. The first one is Andreas Pudlat. The second one will be Leonhard, and the third one may be one of the students. We have also pupils here from the Goethe-Gymnasium, so we have a mixed audience, PhD students, pupils, and Enrique Moore will be the third. Andreas Bucker, the first, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was the best one ever I heard in this research colloquium because of the methodology. So I have two questions. At first, you mentioned that some words have some meanings, positive or negative meanings, but these meanings has a cultural context. So is there any chance to cross the border if you are a non-native speaker? It might be a problem if you are not from the same culture or same language. And my second question is there a chance to uncover different authors of these speeches?
Sorry? Authors.
The politicians often use ghostwriters, and for historians, the author is a very important aspect of historical analysis.
Right. So do we know who has written the speech? Well, and should we collect the question, or should we go direct to the first and the second question?
Well, maybe I can answer.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yes.
So, well, the second question first, because there are rumors about the speech and actually about this final part, which was presumably added by Reagan himself. That is, at the beginning, this part was not supposed to be part of the speech, but actually was just decided lastminute.com by Reagan himself. So just this to answer to the first question. As regards the first word, yes, of course, words do have a weight. I mean, and of course there are words that are basically associated with positive elements, and these are words that politicians tend to use the most. For example, son, children, family, nature, of course. And there are words that have a negative connotation, okay? But, of course, if you are a non-native, this is more difficult to get. But actually, of course, his speech was addressed to American people, yes, and so he had to be understood by American people. And, well, actually, it's important to analyze words, not as isolated elements, but of course also as larger units of meaning. For example, a noun and the adjective associated to that noun. So there are many elements that must be included in the analysis. Well, I don't know if this is what you meant. Okay?
The second thing was the order of that speech.
Well, actually, no, we don't know, of course. Well, I guess the staff, Reagan's staff was composed of many people who will actually help him write speeches. Actually, what I found out is just that this part was added by himself, and maybe some people ignore he would add this part about the evil empire. And actually, he was also criticized by many journalists, politicians, because it was considered a very, very strong way to define the Soviets, of course.
Okay, Mr. Leonard, you have a second.
Yes. Do you think Reagan could have done better with his speech, or do you think this speech was already perfect?
Oh my God. Well, I guess that structurally and linguistically the speech was very good, okay? But of course this is my subjective idea, and I mean objectivity doesn't exist. I think that actually he achieved he reached his target, his objective. For this reason, I consider this speech effective. But of course, this may be source of debate. Okay.
I have an additional question. You mentioned the problem of freeze.
Yeah.
Freezing. This was the background. So the Congress had problems with Reagan's policy of modernization, the army, and to speed up to increase the budget for rearmament. So that is also connected with the question raised by Mr. Leonard. Could he have done better? Was this speech successful in order to convince the Congress? The Congress was very skeptical, very critical concerning the rearmament policy of Ronald Reagan. So could he convince parliamentarians, congressional deputies who were for freezing the budget concerning rearmament? So this is, I think, connected with the question raised by Mr. Leonard.
Okay, in this case, maybe, he was convincing in that context, we can say, but out of the context, it was not as convincing as you mean, or as you might expect, actually.
Only a question. Enrique Moore, please.
Yeah. First of all, thank you. And second, I also have a question concerning methodology. You pointed out 6 distinct features of persuasion that need to be fulfilled in case that persuasion can be successful. And what is it one distinct feature of that is missing? And how can you measure, or what value system is used to classify a great persuasion?
Okay, right. Well, actually, when I talk about critical discourse analysis, this is methodology, and so I can decide, based on scientific criteria, how to analyze a text. That is, what are the main elements, maybe also counting the number of words and their occurrences in a text. This is one thing, of course. But this is again subjective, because I can decide to include something and to leave out something else, okay? So actually, it's useful, but it's subjective. As regards Cialdini, I just decided to include his, this is not an approach, it's just, he's a psychologist, and he gave us principles of persuasion. As this speech is regarded as a very good example of persuasion, I just tried to, see whether these principles could be found in the speech. That's all. But of course, it's subjective. For example, as I told you,
You can use it as a button.
Yeah, I regarded. Where is it? Sorry. Okay, look. I regarded commitment and consistency. I read the final part of the speech, the standing ovation, the applauses, as a sign, that is, as a way for the public to show that it was a sign of, showing that they committed, so they understood the importance of his words, and they will be able to put them into practice, that is, to support his policy. But of course, this is my personal interpretation. I can't guarantee this is, actually an element present in the text, of course. Okay? So maybe not all the 6 principles are present. Okay?
Thank you very much. I would open a second round of discussion. Mr. Heimann, please.
Yeah, you told us that Ronald Reagan had a lot of different methods of making people agree with him, I think. What do you think about actually President Mr. Trump using short messages without nothing of that maybe, and I think he makes people agree with him too.
So you mean comparing?
Yes.
Okay, the 2 presidents. Well, actually, in this case, I think you could help me a lot.
I found my very best.
Well, one thing I could say is just because a few months ago I supervised a thesis about the language, about Donald Trump's language, populism, and, well, actually, most people would say that Donald Trump's speech is completely, say, unthought, free, is just a word salad, okay, with a lot of ingredients without a structure. Actually, what we found out was something different, actually. First, there is a structure, and maybe this is something he wanted, this is the style he decided to adopt, just because through this style he was able to conquer a specific public he wanted to conquer for the elections. So, of course, if we read some tweets, we can say that, oh my God, it seems something, you know, prepared just a few seconds earlier. But actually, this can be, you know, a technique, I guess. Of course, the two presidents, in terms of effectiveness, cannot be compared, maybe.
Well, we can compare everything, but
No,
we have to
can.
keep in mind the differences, and differences are very clear. We are here in the time before email, before internet, before Twitter and SMS and WhatsApp, and communication cultures have totally changed now, and that's the first president using Twitter. Some people are talking about Twittocracy.
Overusing.
Overusing. Yeah. So these are the first differences. And communication has, you know, fastened much more quicker, much more dynamic. Other users, other audiences. So these are the big differences, and it's a totally new way of performance of dealing with new communication structures. But it would be a big, I think, research task to have a, let's say, diachronic comparison, different speech cultures of US presidents.
Yes, of course, we could say the context was different, so it would imply, of course, also the analysis of the historical situation. But yes, this is an interesting, I guess, subject for future research. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Further questions? Silencing, please.
Constructing the bad or the evil is a quite common thing you can find in every politician rhetoric. If I think of my own studies of French-German hostility, you find this very often on the French side, for example. They do it because they are convinced to be the oldest daughter of the church and they are doing right in the name of God, so to say. If you look at America and the tradition of constructing evil in politic rhetoric, I'm thinking of George W. Bush, for example, Axis of Evil, do you find a tradition of constructing the evil, and what does this say about American self-consciousness?
Sorry, the last part, just...
Is there a tradition, if you compare the constructions of evil in different... you mean speeches? Yes.
Okay.
And the second thing?
And what does that say about the American self-consciousness? About how does America see themselves in the world?
In this case, for a linguist, it would be hard to explain. No, actually, I think that, yes, as you said, this dualism, good, evil, right and wrong, it's very common, actually. But of course, he was able to use it in the right context. Okay? Religion, very religious people. So I guess this was a very winning element in the speech. And this element was actually used from the beginning to the end in order to persuade the public that what he was saying was right and the other side was the wrong one. So
I think there's a long continuity of this antagonist, dualist thinking and presenting policy. Think about back to the Roman Empire. Who is not for us is against us. And we have these phrases, these words also in speeches of George W. Bush, and also with John Foster Dulles. Think about the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, in the 1950s when he are talking about neutrality. He said, neutrality is immoral. You are against us. You are not part of the West. So we have, in many cases, this thinking. Think about Herodot. When Herodot is talking about the Persians, these are the barbars. We are the cultivated, civilized culture, good and bad. That's a continuity. And I do not know the exact word in English. We say in German, Manichäismus. Manichäisches Denken.
Yeah,
good and bad.
Manichaeism.
Manichaeism.
Yeah.
So this is nothing new. Maybe it's a special thinking of the West against the East. Maybe also then part of the so-called Christian Abendland thinking. But it's a long story. It's not new. But the question was also, is this an integral part of the American self-perception or self-consciousness of thinking in the US political culture? Good and bad.
Well, I guess it's a recurrent element. It's a recurrent element. And look, I just want to outline something that you said. Yes, he wanted to make them feel responsible, because the most convenient thing would be, okay, I don't want to take part in this dispute. Okay, the word armaments makes me feel scared, but actually he was able to say, if you don't make a decision, you will be responsible. So this was another good element, just to actually make them reflect on the issue, and of course follow his ideas, his attitude.
Are there further questions to our speaker? Again, Mr. Leonard.
I think you know many political speeches, and so I would like to ask you whether you can see a development. Could this kind of speech be possible today? Or did the styles and the rhetorics change?
Well, Well, as I told you, I'm not a political scientist, so so far I have analyzed some speeches, but not so many, maybe to go in such an in-depth analysis. Of course, we can say that there are very effective speakers, people who can really use the weapons of persuasion very effectively, okay, who can structure a very good speech in order to, say, produce those effective and behavioral changes in the public, and others who are not. For example, we can mention someone who was a protagonist in the pro-Brexit campaign in Britain, that's Nigel Farage, okay? Because many people tended to compare Nigel Farage, for example, with Matteo Salvini in Italy, the Northern League representative. But actually, of course, if you watch videos, if you listen to speeches, you see a completely different style. Okay? Well, actually, Farage, though you hate him, you see that he's really, really capable of structuring very effective speeches. Something that, for example, Salvini is not. Completely different style. Okay? Well, actually, he was a very good example of good persuasive practice. But of course, there are many others, and maybe, I could be encouraged by you to find new, say, politicians to be analyzed as example of persuasiveness.
Further questions? If not, I have some. You mentioned video analysis. What you presented to us today was a very precise word-for-word, sentence-for-sentence analysis. Do you also prefer then to use a video of this Reagan speech? In order to look, you mentioned body language, and you mentioned his calm voice. So he seemed to be very, self-confident as how he has to present. The second thing is the audience. You mentioned the special audience he had at this speech in Orlando, Florida. I asked myself, was it really necessary to convince those people who were naturally on his side? So we talked about the inner context and the outside context. So it was a home match maybe for him. Easily victory. So easy gain victory.
Okay, right.
So, and the third thing I would like to come back is that you mentioned for several times the Munich Agreement. Munich. I do not know if everyone in this room knows what is meant with Munich. It was the Munich Agreement of 1938, when the British Chamberlain and the French, the Grenadier, and also Mussolini in Italy agreed to Hitler, getting the Sudetenlands.
Yes,
and this was
yes, actually,
and weakened Czechoslovakia and getting the German-speaking Sudetenlands back to the German Reich. And this was the first step then for the destruction of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. So this image, this historical strong image of 38, appeasement. You don't have to appease a dictator. You don't have to satisfy him. He is, toying with this picture or using this picture, instrumentalizing history. How would you judge this issue, instrumentalizing history? Isn't it not a problem for us also as not only historians, that he, in that case, Reagan, uses Hitler in order to make a comparison with not Gorbachev at that time, but Andropov. Yeah. It was Andropov, as I remember well. So, 3 points.
This is, just starting from the last one, a good example of recontextualization. So, you take something and you use it to your own favor. So, I get is actually instrumentalizing, and this is a typical example of, say, an element used by many presidents. The Munich Agreement has been mentioned by, I guess, all the recent presidents, all the recent American presidents. So evidently, it provokes, it goes straight to the point. So it's effective. Okay. Second, non-verbal elements. Yes, of course. We didn't watch any video. We just worked on the reproduction of his speech. Well, actually, I hinted at some non-verbal elements that would involve, say, a bigger analysis. Also, because in this case, non-verbal communication would imply the analysis of psychologists, of people who studied this field. Of course, linguists do know that not always say is contained in words, but also in what is unsaid. But it is said by gestures, facial expressions, and other elements of the body. We say actions speak louder than words. And so actually also the way we move on the stage and say things, the intonation, and all the other stuff are really important. What I can say, watching the video, is that it was very calm. That so he didn't have any, say, second thoughts, any pauses. So he was really calm, and his pace was really good. It makes me think that he was very, very comfortable, and there was, say, a congruence between the words he was using and his behavior. So this made his speech, I guess, more effective. But there was another question you asked. The second
was it necessary to convince the audience?
Yes. Well, maybe not so much, but I think that if you want to suggest a pro-defense, if you want to pass this pro-defense attitude, so an increase in armaments to people who are against the war, do you think it was something, so easy to do?
This was an audience, was white, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and tough audience, and very religious, faithful, believing in all these good and bad dimensions of the world. So was it so easy for him to make it clear for this kind of public, for this kind of audience, to go through? You mentioned the length of the speech, 24 minutes. That's not so long. Yeah. We have very short speeches, Churchill's speech in Zurich, 1946, 17 minutes. 17 minutes. We have Chinese speeches, 10 hours. Yeah. So we needed 24 minutes, and then applause, big audience, everyone seemed to be satisfied or not. Were the people, not cheering? Were the people not being, crying? Yeah. Yes, Ronnie, you have done your job. So,
of course, yes, he was not in the Soviet Union. Okay, so of course he could expect, say, a sort of complacent attitude towards him. But actually, of course, he reinforced, he strengthened his ideas, because, of course, we are talking about, I would say, not fundamentalists, please, I'm using, but of course people who think religion is a primary value. And so if you want to talk about, say, improving armaments, while around you they are talking about a freeze, maybe he could expect some, say, opponents or some opposite opinion, of course. But of course, it was not in the wrong place. Okay, yes.
So this question was also connected to the issue of perception, of acceptance. And I have also found one point you mentioned in your lecture, very interesting, when you referred to the so-called spiritual crisis. That you mentioned this as a problem, and that something has to be done to overcome this spiritual crisis. And if you look back to 1982, when Helmut Kohl got the chancellery in 1982, he also mentioned the problem of a spiritual crisis, and that one needs to have a geistig-moralische Wende, so kind of a spiritual, moral turn to a better, new political culture. That's a very interesting point. What about the effects of speeches? Well, this speech was 1 year later. Reagan gave this speech in 1983. But maybe there was something in the mood, in the atmosphere, that we have a spiritual crisis, and now we need a shift. Yeah. We need a turn to a better moral, spiritual, consciousness. That's the thing, a very interesting thing. Are there also studies, analysis on the effects of speeches? We have
in the long time,
or that things are lying in the air, and also effects concerning other countries, other cultures, receptions of speeches maybe in Europe. Then US president is talking to the public speech, Cold War, we have East-West tensions, and how is the reception, the perception in other parts of the Cold War areas?
Yeah, of course, in this, I think we should keep into consideration that when you, in this case, you get in touch with texts that are mediated, for example, by translation, by the media, and the best way to analyze texts, even at a later stage, is just to see the original text in order to judge and see. Of course, sometimes we are, say, hit by titles or by simplified ideas, and so I think this is an element we should keep into consideration. Also, we get in touch with things through translation. Are translations reliable, for example? So maybe this is something we should do ourselves. So,
time is over. Are there any questions? If this is not the case, I would like to say I think it was not a bad decision, after having heard your lecture in Genova, to invite you to come to Hildesheim and to give us also this presentation here. Many thanks to Francesco Pierini. I think it was a highlight.
thank you.
Andreas Schubert, who is part of the research colloquium over years, said it was the best lecture he ever heard in methodological and theoretical perspective. I think it's very clear you are a professor, you are a professional, you also have presentations of, young researcher, MA and PhD, work in progress presentation. That's also a point. But I think we need in our research colloquium here and then professionals, established colleagues, experts who will give us impulses and very good informations also, and stimulations, motivations also in an interdisciplinary way. That's important, and that's why I'm very grateful. I think I'm speaking also from the audience perspective. Thanks a lot. Thanks again. It was great. Thanks.